Finger pointing over the Flint water crisis moves to Washington. DPS emergency manager Darnell Early is out. Michigan gets ready for what could be a pivotal primary and Nolan's new book. Settle in. MiWeek starts right now.
Did you know Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago? In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas. We are the business leaders for Michigan.
Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there. Welcome to MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. We are so glad that you're with us tonight. There are so many headlines this week surrounding Flint and its former emergency manager. So what we really want to do tonight is put all of this in context. We may seem like a broken record talking about what is happening in Flint, but it goes beyond what is happening in a city that you may not live in. The response the state is giving, the consequence for leadership, the precedent for changing infrastructure is something we all need to be concerned about. So let's get you caught up. This week, the EPA and the state of Michigan got raked over the coals during congressional hearings in Washington. Some lawmakers calling it criminal that the EPA didn't share with the public that they knew lead levels were elevated in Flint's water supply. The FBI is now investigating what happened with the water contamination. We'll see how this fits in with the AG's investigation and a separate state task force investigation as well. Flint's Mayor Karen Weaver announced a plan to push removal of lead service lines to the highest risk homes. The state's not on board with that yet. And it all comes down to money. This week, outgoing Congresswoman Candace Miller says $1 billion should come to Flint from an EPA fund, and she's going to work to make that happen. There is a lot to get to. Let's bring in our MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. There is no end to twists and turns to this story this week. Did you guys watch the congressional hearing yesterday on Wednesday?
Yeah, bits and pieces, and it was like every other congressional hearing you see. It has very little point other than for the Congress people to, inflate themselves and to look like the public watchdogs. We learned nothing new from that except what we already knew. This was a failure of government at every level. So we know that. There's plenty of blame to go around. Why aren't we now pulling together with some sort of unified strategic plan to fix this? As far as I know, the Michigan congressional delegation as a unit has not yet sat down with the governor to say, look, what are you doing? Here's what we can do. Everybody take a piece of this assignment and let's get this done as quickly and efficiently as we can, instead of sitting back calculating, oh gosh, how can we get the most credit? How can we get the most time in front of the camera? I mean, Brenda Lawrence is running herself silly, trying to elbow onto the stage to get some sort of spotlight here, and it's not even her district.
This is interesting, the political optics of it all, but I want to ask you, Stephen, do you think the congressional hearings were a waste of time? I think it did come down a little bit, parting lines. You heard a lot of Republicans were really going after the EPA, and then you heard some of the Democrats were really going after the state problems as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, as someone who has sat through more congressional hearings than I
You'll never get that time back, will you?
Recount, most of them are a pretty big waste of time. It is about politics. The hearings up on the Hill, they're about politics. They aren't about policy. That gets done on the floor and in bills and things like that. At the same time, I thought it was very interesting to hear both the folks from EPA and the folks from DEQ really explain their side of this in long form, and to hear how each of them took jabs at the other. But you could see sort of the process of all of this and how it sort of just broke down again at every level, that the EPA was not on the ball here any more than the DEQ was. So I think it was worth for us here in Michigan being able to see that. I'm not sure that we've seen that kind of, or that the public has seen that kind of long form explanation of actually what happened here before. So.
All right, but let's talk a little bit about then funding. And you're talking, Nolan, at the federal level, and that there needs to be more of a concerted effort between the delegation here in Michigan. So you do have the two senators from our state, and also along with Dan Kildee, Congressman Dan Kildee, who are saying, look, we want to get this $300 million project through an energy bill. But then you have Candace Miller coming out of left field saying $1 billion from an EPA fund. How does that all translate here?
Well, I mean, it all comes back to the same thing I was talking about. What we need to do first is figure out what we need. And you've got a lot of people running around saying, gosh, we got to replace all the lead pipes. You got the Virginia Tech professor, who's sort of the only hero, or one of the two heroes in this situation, saying we may not need to do that. That may not be the quickest, safest way to fix this problem. Let's figure out the best fix, and not the best political fix, the one that looks, you know, the best on TV. Let's take the emotion out of it. Got to figure out where those pipes are, whether they need to be replaced or simply coated, how much money it's going to take. We don't know any of that because our political leaders have been too busy now scrambling and scurrying all over each other and not sitting down together and figuring out what we need.
Yeah, but I don't think people trust the fact that they're going to say, well, we're going to figure out what the best fix is here, and we're going to take our time figuring out, or we're going to study what the best thing is, and then we're going to eventually. My fear is that a year from now we're going to sit back and you're going to get the studies back in, and you're saying, well, we should have dug up the pipes all along and replaced them anyway.
There's no reason that it should take a year. I mean, there's science here, but Candace Miller asked for $1 billion out of this fund. What does she intend to do with that $1 billion? And, you know,
apparently it doesn't cost $1 billion just to replace the pipes either. I mean, the numbers I saw were in the millions, not the billions for that. So
SPACs are grandstanding.
You do have to, again, you have to sort of segregate some of these things into short-term and long-term priorities. Short-term, the priority is making sure that the drinking water in Flint gets back to safe levels, right? You should be able to drink it, you should be able to bathe in it. There shouldn't be any problem with that. That's absurd. It's absurd that it ever happened. It's absurd that it's gone on as long as it has. Whatever that fix needs to be, they need to figure that out. And we still have real problems with that because the pipes have not recoated quickly, and that could take some time. So is there something else we can do in the meantime to make sure that the people of Flint have what they need? At the same time, the long-term question about replacing pipes, service lines, lead service lines in people's houses, you can't confine that just to Flint. I mean, the biggest mistake we would make would be to do that in Flint and not address it everywhere else. I mean, again, this is a long-term, big picture issue about infrastructure and cities that we need to talk about in bigger context. And
so that you had then Mayor Karen Weaver, who came out this week saying, well, I want to move forward with replacing lead service lines. And then you have Lansing Mayor Verge Bernero, who's like, well, we know how to do that, and we can help you, and we can come in and jump on this. So this lends to everything that we've just been talking about for the last 5 minutes of who is going to lead this, who is eventually going to say, okay, Mayor Weaver, okay, hang on. Where's the leadership here?
It's
and
the governor.
Can the governor play that role anymore, though, because of where this is?
I don't know if he can or not.
Sure he can, because I think he's got the resources and he's got the control over the levers that have to be moved here. He's not certainly being helped by the constant politicizing of this. That certainly weakens
some
his
of it
ability.
in his own office.
Some of it in his own office, sure. But I think that not only limits his ability or his effectiveness, but it also, I mean, everywhere you go. I was out of town last week. Oh gosh, can you drink your water up in Michigan? I mean, this is at risk of really tarnishing Michigan's image, Michigan's reputation, and hurting the state.
Go ahead.
So this is a governor who has shown absolutely no interest over 6 years in dealing with these problems in any bigger sense than the EM law. He has said consistently since he has been governor that the EM law and some of the other little nickel and dime tools that they have are fine enough to get cities back on their feet. And the truth is, that's just, I mean, it's absurd. It's never been true, and now it's embarrassingly untrue. And this is somebody who's got to pivot and say, you know what? We've got to start talking about how we fund cities, how we make sure they have the resources they need to keep people safe, to keep the lights on, all those other things. And we got to talk about infrastructure. He said in his State of the State that he wanted to deal with infrastructure because that's what's lurking behind this problem. We've yet to hear any detail about where he wants to get the money from, where he wants to put a plan together. None of it. This is not his thing, and he is going to have to change a lot about who he is as governor to deal with it, if he's going to deal with it at all.
I was going to say, well, we're not even hearing the kind of specific details coming out of Flint, and I want to get to a little bit of this.
That's not true. I mean, he's put together a plan, and he'll
About
have a
what he
budget.
wants to do.
He'll have a budget on Wednesday that should spell this out. And you know, you said he hasn't done anything for cities. I would argue this
that's
governor.
not what I said. I said he has consistently said that the EM law is the only tool he needs to deal with the problems that cities have, and that's just not true.
Well, it certainly worked in Detroit.
But that was a bankruptcy. What worked in Detroit was a bankruptcy and $800 million from outside.
You could not have done that without the emergency manager. You could not have done that without Kevin Orr.
No other city got that.
All right, but I want to go back to the larger question of, you have the congressional delegation. Now you have the lieutenant governor who says this is the most important work of his life, that he's going to be spending a lot of time in Flint.
Certainly of his political career.
Well, see, now this is what I want to get to. You have the Congresswoman Candace Miller, who could be possibly eyeing a run for governor. You have Attorney General Bill Schuette, who has launched his own investigation. Well, now the FBI is in on that. Does the FBI trump a state investigation into what's going on in the Flint system? And you have Dan Kildee, who could possibly be eyeing a run here. So what I'm saying is you have these a little bit political forces. Why are you laughing at me?
Well, no, I'm laughing
and
at
I
the
want to be able to
situation.
put this in context about how people are coming in to help, but then where is the leadership that is going to be able to bind this all together?
I mean, none of the people who are not the governor can do this. I mean, they can all talk about it, and they can, they can be part of the solution. It's got to come from the governor. The governor has got to take the reins here in a way he has not shown a proclivity to do. And he's got to say, this is my problem. I'm going to solve it not just in the short term, but in the long term, and not just in the small context of Flint, but in the big context of what goes on in cities in this state.
And that's where I think Wednesday's budget presentation will be a clue to what he plans. But you have a whole lot of people out there more interested in helping themselves than helping the people of Flint. You had Debbie Stabenow kind of pushing her way onto the stage at that Rachel Maddow town hall, claiming she's been leading on this from the beginning. That's the first time she'd shown up. You know, you see a crisis and politicians see an opportunity. And until they are willing to subvert their own interests to doing what's needed for Flint, I don't think we're going to make much progress here.
Well, if they can make some noise in Washington and bring home some federal money for Flint, then I think that'll be helpful. All right, moving on tonight, turning now to Flint's former emergency manager and now outgoing DPS manager, Darnell Early. He is taking a lot of blame for what happened in Flint. He dodged a subpoena to appear in Washington this week. He's also taking blame for the downfall of Detroit Public Schools. He resigned this week. We had him on MiWeek last March, where he said he was confident that DPS would come out of emergency management by the time his 18 months were up. Take a look.
By the time you get to my position in this, we're dealing with a situation where there are a number of variables that are different. The city's situation has been, for the most part, resolved, so that's not an overbearing concern. We've got the Educational Coalition that's working, looking at this issue as well. So there are a lot of other factors that are in play now than there were during the terms of some of my predecessors.
All right, they are debating bills about Detroit Public Schools in the legislature today, and also names are being tossed around for the next EM. Who even wants that job? But first off, as we talk about Darnell Early, I want to ask both of you, do you think that he has been unfairly targeted or scapegoated in the Flint and the DPS situation? Nolan, let me start with you.
Well, in Flint, I think clearly MEDQ was at fault here. You had Mark Edwards saying that at the hearing, almost all the responsibility rests with the MEDQ. I don't know how Darnell Early would have known they weren't putting the right chemicals here. The local officials, Jim Lynch of our paper, had a very detailed story last week. I'm talking about how the local officials, the mayor, Halling, pushed and pushed and pushed for this water transfer. I don't know that Darnell Early didn't do exactly what he was asked to do in Flint, and that is balance the books. At DPS, I think he was a little clueless, a little unaware of what was going on in the schools. But when you talk about his mission, did he balance the books? He eliminated the structural deficit. I think he had to go. I think the governor's got to get this package of bills passed. He's got to build support in Detroit for his his proposals for DPS. That wasn't going to happen with Darnell Early sitting there. That's why I think yesterday he got rid of he said we're getting rid of the EAA. That also was an irritant point, and he wasn't going to get this legislation through or with any sort of Detroit support without getting rid of that. So I think what you've seen the governor do is putting all of his efforts towards getting this legislation passed.
Do you think that Darnell Early has been unfairly piled on?
Well, I mean, I think that he's become a symbol of these two issues, and because he's the one link between them, I mean, he sort of shines a little brighter than everybody else. He was in Flint when this decision was made. So, I mean, ultimately, look, the buck stops on his desk at some point, even though he's not the person who made the decision about whether to put chemicals in the water or not. He signed off on the papers to make the switch. So you got to take responsibility for that. And of course, he's been the EM here in Detroit for more than a year, and things have not gotten better. Eliminating the structural deficit is important, but at the same time, the debt has continued to grow, the overall debt in the system, what it owes. So I don't know if it's unfair. I mean, I think it's bigger than him. Both issues are much bigger than him, but I don't think there's anything wrong with calling someone to account for their job. The other thing in DPS is, was he going to be able to go forward and do his job? I mean, I think that's the measure.
And that was the big question that we had actually asked him several times when he was with us last year. Was, you have this plan, but really, how can you implement it? So the next question
He's
is
so
then,
politically hobbled.
Who wants this job? Who's going to be the next EM? We heard from Bridge Magazine. They tossed out a couple of names: Tanya Allen from Skillman Foundation, Charlie Beckham from Head of Neighborhoods in Detroit. But who would really want this job, and what really can you do in this job?
Well, you can't do much of anything. What's key here is whether this legislation gets passed. The emergency manager is pretty much done in Detroit. Get this legislation passed, wipe out the debt, and I think the state is just dying to run out of Detroit once that's done. But the Republican lawmakers have to give their governor a victory on this. I mean, they've got a weakened governor, a governor who's under attack. This is key. A key agenda item. It has to get done, or the state's going to be in a world of trouble financially. They've got to quit playing politics and worrying about the fall, because if they go into the fall with the governor in the shape he's in today, they're going to lose the House anyway. They need to give him a victory on this one.
You know, so the great tragedy in Detroit schools was, I think, the more recent tragedy in Detroit schools has been the work of this tremendous coalition that came together last year to come up with a way to go forward in the district, that we didn't build on that. We didn't build on the broad spectrum of people who were behind that. We didn't build on all the work that they did. And that plan is essentially just sitting on the shelf like 30 other plans to fix DPS. I think that's the way forward. I think you put a superintendent in place, not another EM, an actual superintendent, and that person ought to work through the mayor's office and the governor's office to rebuild the parts of that coalition to start talking about what kind of school district we need and can build between the city and the state for kids here.
That is the plan. I mean, the first assignment of the new emergency manager, we're told, is to find that person, that superintendent, who will be the next person to try to transition this district back to a normal.
But again, the landscape here, and the political landscape, which is always important in DPS, is that you've got all these different constituencies that came to the table in good faith, came up with a plan and came up with ideas, and saw them, for the most part, not take shape. There are big parts of that coalition plan that are not in this legislation, that are not on the table anymore. And I think that's a really missed opportunity to get something done that no one's going to get everything they want. That plan included lots of things that individuals on the committee didn't necessarily love, but they were willing to sign off on it because it was about moving forward together.
So they're starting to debate this in Lansing today. We're going to hear testimony from Mayor Mike Duggan. State Superintendent Brian Whiston is also going to be up there, and they're going to be debating this now for the next several weeks. Before we leave this topic of conversation, you did mention this, that it bears repeating again, that part of this negotiation and getting Democrats on board with this reform package in Lansing was talking about dismantling the EAA, which is the state reform district that's been kind of plodding along since 2011. It has 15 15 schools that is in Detroit. How key do you think that is to dismantling that, to getting some of this legislation passed?
I mean, it was a failed experiment, and we at the News, we questioned from the beginning the concept of it. You take the 15 worst schools and try to fix them when you had an overcapacity of schools. We thought the best approach is to close the 15 worst schools and start working on the next level up. I think there's a certain point at which a school reaches, you can't bring it back.
The problem is if you close those schools, I mean, you have a geographic problem,
those
right?
Kids have to go somewhere.
Those kids got to go somewhere, and there aren't other schools in their neighborhood. So that wasn't very realistic.
You close the building, is what I'm saying. You close the building and move other students, other teachers, other principals.
The thing with the EAA is, the thing that really rubs me the wrong way on the EAA is, these were schools that were awful before. They have been awful since I covered DPS back in the early 90s. And the people who were the strongest critics of the EAA didn't seem all that worked up about those schools when they were under the board's control. And we've got to get past this idea of who's in control and start talking about what happens in the schools. What can we do to fix these? The EAA was an effort to turn these schools around. I think it was, it turned out not to work. But going back to what we had before is not a solution either.
All right, well, we'll be watching what happens in Lansing. The Iowa caucus is on Monday. They've set up what could be a pivotal primary here in Michigan in just about a month. Senator Ted Cruz is planning to open field offices here soon. Hillary Clinton wanted to have that debate in Flint, and we just found out, yes, that they are going to be debating, she and Bernie Sanders, in Flint on March 6th, which is that Sunday before the primary here on March 8th. So it's looking pretty interesting here for me.
And Chad Livengood from our staff just reported this morning that Republicans will have a debate in the city of Detroit on March 3rd. Not 100% confirmed yet, but they're working with Fox News. The RNC and Fox News are negotiating a Detroit debate on March 3rd. I think Michigan's going to, by the time the primaries reach Michigan, Michigan's going to be playing a critical role. I think we're going to see an intense couple of weeks here leading up to March 8th.
Any surprises for you coming out of Iowa and going into New Hampshire?
No, I mean, I think it's unsettled, and that's what we thought it would be. I was a little surprised that Cruz won Iowa. I thought he would do well and come close, but that Trump would win. Mm-hmm. Him winning puts him in more of the driver's seat, I guess, going forward. I don't think he wins New Hampshire. So I don't know. I mean, I think you go to the South after that, really uncertain about what could happen or who could win.
Wasn't all that surprised about Tuesday night, other than Marco Rubio managed to double his poll numbers. He was nowhere near as strong as he finished, and I think he's got some potential now to get the establishment's attention, and maybe a guy who could unite both wings of this party. I'm surprised overall in this campaign. This is a year when Washington is supposed to be sort of the pariah here, and everybody wants outsiders, and Congress has an approval rating of about 9%. 5 of the 6 candidates who you could say came out of Iowa strong and with a significant performance are from Washington. They're all of them have either been senators or are senators, and not one governor has survived the Iowa caucus.
It is interesting. As we wrap this up, Stephen, what do you think that candidates are going to have to? How are they going to try to convince Michigan voters? What are going to be the key issues?
I mean, I think, immigration, terrorism, immigration here plays differently than it does in other parts of the country. There have been some awful things said about immigrants, and they will, people here will remember that. Once these candidates get here, there'll be a lot of tough questions.
All right. And finally tonight, as we wrap up, we have an author at the table. Nolan just published his, is this your first book?
Yeah, I mean, it's
just
thanks,
Fred.
It's a
Our
collection.
Our manager, Fred Murray, just brought in
it's a
Nolan's
collection of columns over the last 16 years at the Detroit News, and it was kind of fun to put together. Steve wrote the foreword.
No.
He did.
How did
Very
you
good
convince him to do that?
I paid him.
Did you?
There was some alcohol involved.
There's a 10% proceed.
Yeah. He gets all the profits, and it's probably the best thing in the book. But it's.
I always ask authors to do this. Explain the title.
Okay, the title was
called The Little Red Hen.
A column I wrote years ago talking about the sort of children's stories. My mother emphasized when I was growing up, and she loved the Little Red Hen story because it was who she was. She believed very much in hard work and self-reliance and the consequences of bad decisions. And, you know, so, you know, I wrote a column about those children's stories and sort of how they compared to the messages of today. But there's a lot in there about Detroit over the years and how it's evolved and how my views on Detroit have evolved over the years. You know, some personal columns, some political columns. So I hope it's folks enjoy it.
We can find it on Amazon.
Amazon, right.
We can find it on Amazon. And in the 20 seconds that we have left, how long have you guys now known each other and been friends?
I don't know, 6 years, 7 years.
But it's really my week.
Feels like
But
20.
it's really my week that has cemented this friendship, right? Right? That you were able to write the foreword for his book.
It was not my week. It was well before the show.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty cool.
It's an unlikely pairing.
It is.
Let's just say
it is
that.
an unlikely pairing, but I think it's interesting. So go ahead, check out Nolan's book. Even if you don't agree with him all the time, he'll always make you think.
Well,
and I think that's what's that you wrote in the foreword, which I always think is interesting. So what do you mean no one agrees with you all the time? All right. Hey, thanks guys.
Thank
That's going to do it for my week. As always, we appreciate you joining us every week for our show and supporting Detroit Public Television. Find us at MiWeek.org and on Facebook and on Twitter. We're there. I'm Christy McDonald. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Did you know 2 Men and a Truck has performed 5.5 million moves to date? Or Dawn Food Products, the customer service staff at their international home office in Jackson, Michigan, speaks over 15 different languages. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas. This spirit of entrepreneurism is the foundation for a rich and prosperous future. We are the business leaders for Michigan.
Funding is also provided by Delta,